and yet freedom evolves. You know, so we're more free now. Just go to Freddy's and look at all the choices you have. My goodness, or the apps, or the music, or the politics, or whatever you want. There's just so many choices. We're paralyzed by choice, says Malcolm Gladwell, right? Just so many choices, because we have so much freedom. That's just absolutely crazy. And you have more control over yourself, because you know why you're making these choices. Because you can step back out of yourself and say, oh, my mother and father taught me this, my church taught me this, my high school teacher that I really liked taught me this, and as a result, I think this. And you know what? I can step out of that and think for myself now. What the heck should I do? Because once I'm on my own, wow. That's there's that Nietzsche feeling, where do I get my meaning from, That's depressing. Let's go hop out a window. Darn it, the windows are sealed. New York learned its lesson, right? Russia still, you get to the 10th floor of a building in Russia and all these people fall out of them. In fact, my one friend has a name for it, defenestration. Falling out of a window. Because so many of the enemies of Putin seem to just fall out of windows on the 10th floor in Russia. Okay. But so Charles Sanders Peirce is reacting to Kant, but his focus is on symbolic logic, rhetoric, making our ideas clear. Personally, it was kind of interesting. He grew up, his father was a math professor at Harvard, or the Lawrence Scientific Institute in Cambridge, which I think is part of Harvard at the time. And so he grows up not only studying math with his father, becomes a land surveyor with his father, and his father was actually the head of the Geodetic Survey, which was the government's survey team primarily designed to map around the Washington, D.C. area in order to build fortifications to keep the Confederates from attacking Washington, D.C. So he was part of that. And then at the same time, he was studying philosophy. And he was also tasked with studying the speed of light, trying to measure the speed of light. So he had certain tasks that he was trying to do. In fact, I could go back. So pragmatism, what does it literally mean? That which has been done. That's Greek. The equivalent might be the Latin word thing, res. I don't know where I put that in there, but Kant uses pragmatism as a relation to some definite human purpose. Kant had actually written a book called An Anthropological Pragmatism, I think, something like that. Peirce says it's how knowledge is related to human action. And his foundation is in a behavioral semiotic, or a theory of signs. So you have to study how language works as a behavioral study, right? So people say this and then do this. They say this, then do this. Say this, then do this. So you sit there with the data. You say, okay, so this sound results in this action. This sound results in this action. So this means that action. So it's a theory of signs. A word's meaning is its use. Meaning, logic, and rhetoric. So that's the traditional sequence. You understand how language works, then you can apply it logically And then once you understand the logic of it, you can build speeches out of it, right? Don't have to follow that pattern anymore. You could just say nonsense as long as you're president, I guess. And it doesn't have to be logical. How many people think that a tariff is actually something that the country that the tariff is imposed on pays? Nobody, right? Because if you put the tariff on China, then anything you import from China, the government of the United States charges the people who are buying it the tariff, right? I mean, you know,
So they don't buy the product.
all the economists I know are all saying the same thing. You know, he doesn't understand what a tariff is, etc. Okay. So for him, the pragmatic maxim meaning is the connection between action and experience. Really quite boring if you think about it. This is a science, you know, just studying the meaning of language and figuring out the context of things. He was born in Cambridge. His father was Benjamin, leading mathematician and astronomer at Harvard. Graduated in 1859. Remember, the war starts in what, 60, 61? The Civil War, right? Goes to 64, 65. And we just had the anniversary of Grant and Lee signing the surrender of Lee in the courthouse of Appomattox Courthouse, right? It was just a couple days ago. Didn't actually end the war because there were two other armies out there still fighting at the time. So he spent 15 years as an astronomer measuring light, physicist for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey where he worked for his dad, and in private philosophical studies. But then he became a lecturer in logic at Johns Hopkins University, and notice this is where it ties in to John Dewey. So you wonder what way John Dewey was so much younger. How did he get to become part of Louis Menand's book on the founding pragmatists? Well, he gets tied in because he went to lectures given by Charles Sanders Peirce. So that's the tie-in. Ended up being kicked out of his position because he dated a married, divorced, I don't know when she was divorced, but he dated a divorced woman from France, and that was totally abhorrent at the time, and so he was fired. You can't have a professor who dates a divorced woman. It's just crazy. He eventually married her, and they moved to a home in Pennsylvania. It's just 2 miles down the road from the Walmart near the Delaware Water Gap. Well, the Walmart wasn't there then. Risby. So you could actually visit Arisby. That's where he lived. Let's go back one. So it's a little hidden from the woods, but it's still there. It's just a house, but it's where he lived, and so he and his wife until he died. Supported totally by William James at that point, because he couldn't get a job because, dating a divorced woman, just totally wrong. So I probably drunk a lot of alcohol too while I was there. So I don't know. Maybe they ought to have a bar, at the house I spoke. In any case, move on to James. William James, 1842, 1910. And notice a traditional view was that what united all of the pragmatists was what's called the unproblematic. They all believed in this. And what was it? Well, the prestige of science and scientific method. They're all deeply into the contemporary science. The strength of empiricism. Knowledge comes from our perceptions, and that's very British, right? The British empiricists, right? Biological evolution. I mean, Darwin, of course, his book 1859, but remember the current is already saturating the academic, the literary, and the scientific environment when that happens. So they're all involved in that. They're all, and of course, it's going through different stages. There are people fighting over what evolution might mean, etc. They're also completely supporting the ideals of American democracy, and that's Lincoln's ideals. Remember, Lincoln in that speech at Gettysburg focuses on the Declaration of Independence as the founding of our cultural belief regarding government, not the Constitution. Because of all men are created equal business, right? That's where that seems to be the ideals of American democracy. Peirce, notice, was a scientist. James was primarily thought of as a psychologist. His field was psychology. George Herbert Mead, who's another member of the Metaphysical Club, was a sociologist. And John Dewey was an educator. And no, John Dewey is not the same Dewey that gave us the Dewey Decimal System. That is the way that the library arranges the stacks in the library, right? Peirce gave us pragmaticism, which was, remember that updated version of the word? And Dewey gave us instrumentalism, because knowledge is an instrument, as far as he was concerned. But James's life, he was born in New York City. Father was very rich, theologian for the Swedenborgian New Jerusalem Church, the New Church also so called. Have you ever heard of the Swedenborgian Church or the New Church? So I thought this is kind of neat. There's a church. Well, here's Emanuel Swedenborg. That's easy to remember. He's from Sweden. Kind of amazing how that works, right? No, he's not an American at all. He dies in Sweden. But he was a scientist, and then all of a sudden, something happened to him, and he became a mystic and discovered that he was Jesus in the second coming. And he just started writing book after book on the angels and all sorts of things, explaining how now that he's here, this is the second coming, etc. So he had all these visions, Easter weekend of April 6, 1744. And so he ended up received a revelation that Jesus Christ had appointed him to write the doctrine, etc. Kind of interesting. But William James's father was a member of the church, and it seems almost like they were all rich. So it strikes me, what's the name of that weird church group that used to be in Hollywood? That all the Scientology, yeah. Not really that familiar with it, but just the idea that most of the people involved seem to be pretty rich, that struck me as, hey, that's interesting. But
you have to pay for the next level.
This is in Pennsylvania, right near where my wife grew up in Fox Chase, And so I visited this place whenever we were there. Donna would spend a lot of time sitting with her dad in the home, and that bored me to death. Sitting there, talking with a guy that couldn't move, etc. So after I talked for a requisite amount of time, I had to go, and I went. Where did I go? Well, this was local, so I went and I visited Bryn Athyn, and that's a church built stone by stone, based on a copy of one of the British cathedrals. So it's kind of amazing. There's a museum there, and the focus of the museum in the house was on religious artifacts, and they were primarily interested in Egyptian artifacts, so there was a lot of Egyptian things in the museum. Fascinating place. And they have a college there, a college of Bryn Athyn, which is primarily for people who are members of the religion, but you don't have to be a member. But if you go, you have to go to all the religious things. So you get the idea, peer pressure, etc. So that's kind of interesting. So Swedenborg, but William James family, go back to this. His father was so rich, he wanted the best education for his children, and so he decided to take them to what schools he could find that were the best. As it turned out, he took them to different schools all over Europe. As a result, the kids all ended up learning German and French. It turned out none of the schools that were considered to be the best were up to standard as far as he was concerned. So they ended up moving from school to school almost monthly. So let's try this school. Let's try this one. But it continued on. William James wanted to be an artist. Ended up going to Harvard and got his medical degree in 1869. Notice that's after the Civil War is over. And he went on an expedition to Brazil. And I should have mentioned Louis Agassiz. So at the time, a professor who was originally from Switzerland, Louis Agassiz, was the head biologist. And in fact, if you go to Harvard today, they have a building that's named the Louis Agassiz Museum. It's a museum with all the natural history, bones and fish and all the different animals, skeletons, and so on. But he was the famous professor, so he was their teacher for quite a few generations there. And oddly, he was totally against evolution. Considering the movement, was all pro-evolution, he was totally against it. And in fact, the trip to Brazil was to prove that if there was an ice age, that it happened in Brazil too. Because he was of the opinion that if God made an ice age, he would have made the whole world an ice age, not just, north and, wherever, right? So he went to Brazil to try to prove that there was an ice age there too. And he thought he found reasons to show that. And, William James was like, I don't think so. But what's neat